A lot of Christians are doing all the right things. They're reading scripture, they're listening to sermons, they're going to Bible studies, they're serving. And yet somewhere deep down there's still this ache. This sense that there has to be more than this. More than just learning more Christian information, more than just staying busy in church, more than just trying to become a slightly better version of yourself. And if you felt that, I don't think that ache is something you need to be ashamed of. It may actually be one of the truest things about you. Because you were made for more than status quo Christianity. You were made for union with God. And that's what this channel is really about. Simple Contemplative is about helping Christians recover this deeper life with God in a way that is simple and grounded and actually livable. Not escaping real life, not becoming weirdly spiritual, not adding one more heavy burden to your faith, but learning to live from deeper communion with God. And this matters to me because this was my story. I've held all sorts of roles in the church. I've been a lead pastor, I've been a small groups pastor, I've been a missionary, I went to seminary, I read all the books and listened to all the sermons and did all the Bible studies. And through all of it, I was hungry for transformation. I wanted more of God. But for a long time, I still felt like I had plateaued. I had all the language, all the activity, and all the desire, but something in me still wasn't being transformed in the way Scripture seemed to describe. And things didn't really begin to change until I started to realize that maybe I had been aiming at the wrong thing all along. Not something bad, just something too small. I had to change my aim to something so much bigger than the status quo Christian life. Something so big that just the dream of it began to capture the desires of my heart. So in this video, I want to look at what this ache is all about. I want to talk about the forgotten goal of the Christian life, and we'll look at why we can do many good Christian things and still miss the deeper destination. We'll look at what union with God actually means and how Bernard of Clairvaux' 4 degrees of love can actually help us understand this journey. Because before we talk about growing and praying and surrendering or even becoming more like Christ, we have to make sure the ladder is leaning against the right building. At the beginning of any journey, you have to know where you're going. That sounds obvious, but spiritually, I think this is where a lot of us get stuck. Because if you don't know the destination, you can still move, you can still work, you can still climb, you can still make progress, but you may not actually end up where your soul was made to go. It's kind of like climbing a ladder that's leaning against a building. You can climb with sincerity, you can climb with discipline, you can climb with a lot of energy and effort. But maybe the scariest thing would be to get near your goal and realize that the ladder was leaning against the wrong building the whole time. And I don't say that to make sincere Christians afraid, I say it because I think a lot of us know what it feels like to give ourselves to the Christian life and still wonder, is this really all there is? And so when I say status quo Christianity, I don't mean church is bad. I don't mean Bible studies and sermons and theology or ordinary obedience are bad. Those are all gifts. But status quo Christianity is what happens when those good things become the ceiling instead of the pathway. It's the version of Christianity where the goal becomes being just a little more informed, a little more moral, a little more active, but not necessarily more united to God. And that's a very subtle danger, because the wrong building may not look wrong. It may look very Christian. It may be labeled knowledge or ministry or usefulness. It may be labeled being a better person. And again, all those things can be good, but none of them are the final goal. And that's where things break down. I was talking with a friend recently who's been in ministry for over 20 years. And from the outside, he had seen the kinds of things that many of us would call success. Church growth and influence and fruit and opportunities. But after some kind of painful setbacks in his professional life, he started reevaluating everything. Not in a cynical way or a bitter way, but in a searching way. He was asking, have I been pursuing the wrong things? Have I been measuring the right things? Have I been climbing the right building? And I think that question is more important than most of us want to admit. Because Jesus himself seems to warn us about this. In Matthew 7, he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Then he says, "Many will come to him and say, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And Jesus says, 'I never knew you.'" That's one of the most sobering passages in the whole Bible, I think, because these are not people who just followed the ways of the world. They did things many of us would recognize, immediately as spiritual success. They prophesied, they cast out demons, they performed miracles. Honestly, if I were doing those things, I'd probably feel like things were going pretty well. But Jesus says that the issue was, "I never knew you." And so the frightening thing in that passage is not that they failed to be busy enough. The frightening thing is that they did visible religious works and still missed the deeper reality of knowing and being known by God. You see, that means activity for God can never replace intimacy with God. Usefulness for God can never replace union with God. Knowledge about God can never replace knowing God. Because the goal of Christian life is not just becoming more impressive and more informed or more useful. The goal is union with God. So before we talk about how to climb the ladder, we need to make sure the ladder is actually leaning against the right building. You see, for much of historic Christianity, the goal of the Christian life was not described merely as going to heaven when you die. It was not merely described as being a good person or believing the right things. The goal was union with God. Now, I know that phrase may sound a little strange depending on the kind of Christian world you come from. For some of us, union with God sounds almost too mystical. It can sound like something outside the bounds of normal Christianity. I remember when I first started kind of encountering this language, part of me wondered if it was heresy. Because I had categories for believing in God and obeying God. I had categories for having a relationship with God. But union with God sounded like a whole other level of intimacy that I wasn't sure I was allowed to want. But this is not some fringe idea. This is woven deeply through Scripture and through the Christian tradition. We often talk today about having a relationship with God, and that language is good, but sometimes, at least in our modern world, we use the word relationship in a way that it's much thinner than what Scripture is inviting us into. A relationship can remain distant or formal. A relationship can remain mostly transactional. For instance, you can have a relationship with your mailman. You can have a relationship with a coworker. You can have a relationship with someone you technically know, but they can still remain just an acquaintance. But Scripture uses language that goes much deeper than that. In John 10, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father." And that's stunning. Jesus doesn't say, "I know my own" in some distant religious sense. He says he knows his own, and his own know him, just as the Father knows him, and he knows the Father. You see, that is deep intimacy. That's communion. That's participation in the very love between the Father and the Son. And the word translated as know there is the Greek word ginosko. Now, ginosko means to know, recognize, or come to know something. But it's more than just knowing facts. It carries the sense of personal and relational and experiential knowledge. In some biblical contexts, this language of knowing is even used for the physical intimacy between a husband and a wife. And so when Jesus says, I know my own and my own know me, we should not hear that as cold theological information. This is not merely, I know some things about God. This is relational knowing, covenantal knowing, intimate knowing. The kind of knowing where love is not just believed, but shared. Where God is not simply an object we study, but the one we are drawn into communion with. This is why Scripture so often uses marriage imagery to describe God's relationship with us. God's not merely inviting us to follow rules from a distance. He's not merely inviting us to become productive employees in His religious organization. He's inviting us into covenantal love, into communion. And this is where the ache for more starts to make sense, because if you are made for union with God, then of course status quo Christianity would feel too small. You were made to become one with Christ in love. You were made for intimate union with the one who is life, the one who is love, the one who holds the whole universe together. And so maybe the ache for more is actually the soul remembering what it was made for. And that changes how we understand the whole journey. Because if union with God is the goal, then spiritual growth is not mainly about trying to become impressive. It's about being drawn deeper into love. And so if union is the destination and growing deeper in love is how we get there, we need a way to understand how love matures. And this is where Bernard of Clairvaux gives us a map. Back in the early 1100s, there was a Cistercian monk named Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was born in 1090 and became one of the most influential Christian voices of his time. Some church historians have even called him the last of the great church fathers. He was a counselor to several popes. And when he joined the monastery around the age of 22, he reportedly brought about 30 other people with him because of the weight of his personality. Most of his life he was physically sickly, but even in weakness there was just something about him that made people stop and listen. One of the great themes of his life was the love of God and union with God. He preached 86 sermons on the Song of Solomon, exploring it as a picture of the soul's relationship with God. And he didn't even make it through the whole book. So if you've ever thought I take a long time to get through a point, Bernard makes me feel a lot better. And so this was not just a side topic for him. This was central. You see, Bernard taught that there are 4 degrees of love. And for our latter image, I want you to picture these as kind of 4 sections of the climb. Not 4 quick steps, not 4 boxes you check, but 4 movements in the maturing of the soul. And so the first degree is loving myself for my own sake. This is really where we all begin. Life is centered on me. My needs, my desires, my comfort, my survival, my image, my little kingdom. And this is the natural state of immature love. Every child begins here. Every human life begins here. The self is curved inward. The world is interpreted through the lens of what does this do for me? And God isn't shocked by that, but He doesn't want to leave us there. Then the second degree of love is loving God for my own sake. And this is kind of where the spiritual journey begins for many of us. We come to God because we need forgiveness. We need peace or salvation or help. We need God to to fix what we can't fix. And none of that is bad. Again, this is where most of us tend to start the spiritual journey. But again, God is merciful. God meets us in our need. Jesus invites the weary and burdened to come to him. So this isn't something to be ashamed of, but it's still not the fullness of love. Because at this stage, I love God largely because of what God does for me. You know, God has entered my life, but I may still be relating to him through self-interest. I may love the gifts more than the giver. I may love heaven more than God. I may love what God can do for my life more than I love God himself. When my wife Allison and I first met, she was 10 years older than me. And actually, she still is. And because of that, she was already more established in her career. You know, she was even in the process of building her own house. And so the joke was that I was marrying her for her money. Now, if that had been true, you know, that would not have been love. That would have been me using her. It might have even looked like love from the outside. You know, I could have said the right words. I could have gone through the ceremony. I could have, you know, enjoyed the relationship. But if the deepest thing in me was, you know, what can I get from her, then I wouldn't really be loving her for her sake. I would be loving her for my sake. And I think this kind of exposes something tender in our relationship with God. Because God is still gracious enough to meet us when we come to him for our own sake. But he also loves us enough to draw us beyond that. You know, he doesn't want to be merely useful to us. He wants to be loved by us. And that brings us to the third degree. The third degree is loving God for God's sake. And this is where love begins to be purified. You know, we love God not just because he forgives us, not just because he helps us. We love God because God is God. Because he is beautiful, because he is good, because he is worthy, because he is the deepest desire of the human soul. Now this is love that has moved beyond transaction. In seminary, one of my professors shared a story that I think illustrates this beautifully. You know, he once visited one of his older mentors, a man who had a debilitating illness, and this man was in excruciating pain. You know, he could barely move without suffering. And yet somehow he remained in good spirits. You know, there was still love and joy in him. And my professor asked him, you know, how he could endure that kind of pain and still carry that kind of spirit. And his mentor said something I've never forgotten. He said, after all is said and done, and I stand before the judgment throne of God, you know, I don't even care if God sends me to hell. All I ask is that before he does, I want to kiss the feet of Jesus. Now that is an intense statement. You know, he wasn't trying to make a theological argument about heaven and hell. He was expressing love that had moved beyond reward, love that had moved beyond fear, love that had moved beyond just saying, God, I love you because of what you will give me. A love that was so great, it carried him through all of his painful trials. Now he was saying, I want Jesus even before I think about what I receive. Even before I think about reward, even before I think about relief, I want him. That's the third degree of love, loving God for God's sake. And that's a different kind of Christianity that many of us were taught to aim for. Because we often unconsciously ask, what do I get out of it? You know, do I get blessing? Do I get purpose? Do I get a better life? And again, God is generous. God gives good gifts. But love matures when God himself becomes the gift. Then the fourth degree is loving, or you might say losing myself for God's sake. You know, this is union. And this one is harder to understand because it's so foreign to the way most of us live. And most of us are almost always thinking about ourselves. How am I doing? Am I growing? Am I failing? Am I okay? Even our spiritual life can become one more place where the self stays at the center. But Bernard describes this fourth degree as the place where, even if only for a moment, we lose ourselves as though we did not exist. And not because the self is destroyed, but because the self is no longer the center of attention. We become, as he says, of one mind with God. And the prayer, "Thy will be done," becomes not just obedience, but delight. Bernard himself said this degree is something we may taste in this life, but we don't fully remain in it until eternity. And so this isn't self-hatred. It's not disappearing as if you no longer matter. It's being so united to God that even your relationship with yourself is held within God's love. You no longer relate to yourself as a separate little project you have to protect or improve or, promote or defend. You receive yourself in God. You love yourself in God. You're caught up in God. Bernard used the image of a drop of wine placed into water. The wine itself remains. It doesn't cease to exist. But it becomes so mingled with the water that the two seem united. He also compared it to iron heated in fire until the iron begins to glow with the fire's own heat and light. And so the iron is still iron, but it has become radiant with something beyond itself. And that's a picture of union. Not absorption where you disappear, but a love so deep that the self is no longer curved in on itself. The self is found in God. And this is the movement of the Christian life, from self for self's sake, to God for self's sake, to God for God's sake, and finally to self in God. That is the ladder of love. But one word of caution here, because the moment we hear the word ladder, many of us immediately turn it into another achievement project. We start asking, what degree am I in? How do I get to the next one? How do I know if I'm making progress? How do I become more spiritually advanced? And you see, if we begin to do that, we may accidentally move the ladder right back to the wrong building. Because this is not a ladder of religious achievement. It's a ladder of love. And love doesn't grow by force. It grows as we are formed, as we return, as we surrender. And so before we leave this image, I want to look at the ladder itself. Because if the 4 degrees of love show us the direction we're moving, the ladder itself shows us how God actually forms love in us. The first side of the ladder is experience. And experience can be both beautiful and painful. Because love is not just an idea we believe. Love has to be encountered. Some of the most healing moments in my life have been moments where I experienced the love of God in a way that was deeper than words. Not just believed it, but not just sang songs about it, but experienced it. There are moments when the love of God becomes more real than the shame you've carried. More real than fear, more real than the false stories you've believed about yourself. And those moments can heal something in us that information alone can't reach. But experience is not only the beautiful moments. God also redeems and forms us through the seasons we would never choose. Through loss, through disappointment, through failure, through the places where our old ways of controlling life stop working. Some of the most painful seasons of my life have also been some of the most formative. Not because pain is good in itself or suffering should be romanticized, but because God can meet us there in ways we would not have received anywhere else. And so experience matters because love has to become real. But experience alone isn't enough because most of life is not one dramatic spiritual moment after another. And this is where the other side of the ladder comes in, repetition. Repetition is the slow return. Returning to prayer, returning to scripture and silence, returning to worship or confession, returning to contemplative prayer and ordinary faithfulness and the means of grace. And most of the time, repetition doesn't feel dramatic. You may pray one morning and not feel transformed. You may sit in silence and feel mostly distracted. You may return to God again and again and wonder if anything is happening at all. But over time, repeated return reorders the soul. You see, the things we practice shape what we love. The things we return to shape what we desire. The things we give ourselves to slowly shape who we become. And this is why spiritual disciplines matter. Not because they earn God's love, not because they're spiritual productivity hacks. They matter because they create space for love. They train us to return. They put us again and again in the place where God can meet us and heal us and draw us deeper. And just a quick plug, if you want a simple way to begin practicing that kind of repeated return to God, I have a free 7-day guided journal linked below. It's just a gentle way to practice honesty and surrender and returning to God in the middle of real life. And so one side of the ladder is experience and the other side is repetition. And the thing that ties the two together is surrender. That's the rungs of the ladder. Because every movement deeper into love requires some form of letting go. Letting go of control, letting go of self-protection, letting go of using God. Letting go of needing spiritual progress to make us feel impressive. Letting go of the version of ourselves that keeps trying to turn everything, even God, into a project. And this is why the ladder of love is so different from self-improvement. Self-improvement often says climb higher so you can become someone worth loving. But the gospel says you are loved and that love will draw you higher. See, self-improvement says fix yourself, but union says come closer. Love says receive the God who already desires you and surrender whatever keeps you from receiving him. So how do we climb? We receive love. We return to love. We surrender whatever keeps us from love. Again and again. And slowly the soul begins to move from loving self for self's sake to loving God for self's sake to loving God for God's sake and finally loving or losing self for God's sake. And this is why the whole message is hopeful, because if you feel restless or stuck or unsatisfied with status quo Christianity, that may not mean something is wrong with you. It may mean your soul knows it was made for union. Because you were made for more. You were made for more than being busy for God. You're made for more than become a slightly better version of yourself. You were made for God, for communion, for love, for union. This is where true life is found. So if you've carried that ache for more, maybe you don't need to bury it. Maybe that ache is an invitation. Maybe God is inviting you higher or into something deeper. He's inviting you into himself. And so I hope you're beginning to see that the true beauty of the Christian journey, something so much higher than anything I've ever met before. And it begs the question, if union with God is the goal, what keeps us from living from that union? That is where the false self comes in. The false self is the version of us that can use religion, ministry, even spiritual disciplines to avoid union with God. So if this video helped name the destination, the next step is learning to recognize what gets in the way. So be sure to watch this video next, because the forgotten goal of the Christian life is union with God, and the false self is what keeps trying to settle for something smaller.